Are charter schools state schools or are they private schools? And can they be religious schools? There's an Oklahoma court case that has made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and we should have answers to these questions within a few weeks. About 2 weeks ago, an Oklahoma court case made it all the way to the Supreme Court and was argued before the justices about the question of discrimination against religion. That principle of non-discrimination is at the heart of a case that the Supreme Court is considering related to a charter given to a school called St. Isidore, which was an application for an Oklahoma charter school put forward by the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City and the Diocese of Tulsa. In other words, it's a proposal to make a charter school a Catholic school. Now, charter schools, by definition, are state-funded schools, so in that sense, they're like public schools, and yet they're not normal public schools because charter schools are operated by private organizations. In other words, the state pays money to an organization to privately operate a school. Now, up until now, it has been a useful model because the statistics tell us that charter schools are able to emphasize some things that public schools typically can't do. For example, there are charter schools that emphasize the hard sciences or engineering and math. There are charter schools that emphasize liberal arts and literature. There are even language immersion schools where all of the instruction is in a particular language that the children learn by immersion. In fact, in the state of Oklahoma, there's even a Comanche charter school where all of the instruction is done in the Comanche language as a part of their instructional format. All of this has been good, especially because studies generally show, a study recently by researchers at Stanford University found that charter school students outperform students from public schools, particularly in the areas of math and reading comprehension. Yet while charter schools function more like private schools, the way that they are considered public schools is because they receive funding from the state. It's the combination of private school style diversity with public funding that has made charter schools so appealing to many parents, because what they're offered is an improved opportunity for education for their children, and yet it comes with the same kind of free education that is typically associated with public schools. In other words, we've discovered that if you privatize schools, you tend to do better in your outcomes. The state has found it to their advantage to pay to support those schools because the product, the graduates that they're getting, are typically stronger and better, therefore more productive citizens moving forward in the state. The problem becomes when, in Oklahoma, this is the first a watershed case, Oklahoma became the first state to approve a charter from an explicitly religious organization. St. Isidore is to be a charter school but it's to be a Catholic charter school. And originally, the state of Oklahoma approved the charter. The argument was that they will have a specialized focus, just like any other charter school is allowed to have, and parents will be able to choose to send their children to that school or not. The Attorney General of Oklahoma signed off on this, but after the last election, a new Attorney General took office in Oklahoma, a Republican by the name of Gettner Drummond. Drummond argued that a religious charter school is by definition unconstitutional because it would qualify as a state establishment of religion. It's interesting that the Attorney General would sue to revoke the charter that was granted to St. Isidore on the basis that it was an establishment of religion, because his argument is that the state has no business promoting a particular religious viewpoint. Now, while the separation of church and state is meant to be a protection against the government determining the religious options for its citizens or paying tax money to establish institutional expressions of religion with tax money of people whose consciences object to that, the separation of church and state is not designed to keep religious voices out of the public square. St. Isidore is a private religious nonprofit organization funded by, as I said, the two major Catholic dioceses in the state of Oklahoma. They have quite a bit of experience running successful schools. This school plans to use a well-established program and curriculum that has already produced a 100% graduation rate and a 98% college admission rate for Oklahoma students. It is appealing to lower income families, and because St. Isidore will be a virtual charter school, that is, it will be available online, it is accessible for people in the rural parts of the state of Oklahoma who really have until now had limited options about what their children could find for education. Now, in a culture where the public school curriculum often runs counter to the beliefs and the values of parents, families, it seems like, should be free to redirect their tax dollars towards school options that align with their values. St. Isidore's is Catholic. I'm not Catholic, but I would argue that this is an option made available to parents which views parents as partners in their children's education and not competitors. Now, the Attorney General has argued that a religious charter school should be an unconstitutional illegality. There's an easy way to understand how to move forward on this. If we view the issue of a charter school not as a question of the content of the curriculum, but rather just as a question of government funding, then there are plenty of Supreme Court precedents already in place that should make the decision in this case a slam dunk. When you examine the Supreme Court's track record on not preventing religious groups from receiving public assistance, just like other groups, it would seem like Attorney General Drummond's position really does amount to discrimination against religion. Again and again, the Supreme Court has argued that governments cannot discriminate against religion when it awards generally available funds or public benefits. Let me give you the examples. In Trinity Lutheran, a case known by Trinity Lutheran, the state of Missouri had a grant program to support improvements to school playgrounds. The grants were open to private schools, but not to religious private schools. The Supreme Court said that was unconstitutional. Similarly, a case in Montana involved a program of state-funded scholarships that could be applied to private schools, but again, they excluded religious schools. The Supreme Court said that exclusion was also unconstitutional. Most recently, in a case called Carson versus Macon, the state of Maine offered a tuition assistance program to certain private schools, but they again excluded religious schools. And for a third time in the last 20 years, the Supreme Court said this discrimination against religious schools is unconstitutional. In other words, if the government makes a public benefit available, it cannot refuse to allow people to participate in applying for that public benefit simply because they are religious. That string of cases really provides the Supreme Court with a roadmap for this Oklahoma case. Oklahoma makes charter school designations generally available. That is, anybody can apply and go through the process of establishing a charter school. Remember, a charter school is privately run. They have their own curricular choices. They have their own boards that direct the schools. They receive state funds, and it is to the advantage of the state because those funds actually get better results spent through privatized education than typically we're seeing in most public education systems. And yet, the Attorney General has argued that that this money amounts to an establishment of religion when applied to a religious school. The Supreme Court will probably rule against him and overturn this decision because of their pre-existing positions on discrimination on the basis of religion being unconstitutional in the granting of government monies. I think if they look at this from a funding standpoint, the decision is probably going to be pretty easy for the Supreme Court to make. Drummond's argument at the end of the day is that if we allow a Catholic charter school, then there is no preventing the possibility of, say, a Muslim charter school or a Hindu charter school. These are interesting questions. Here's what I want us to see. First of all, let's look at what Scripture has to say about education in general. In Proverbs chapter 4, verse 13, the writer says, "Take hold of instruction, do not let go, guard her, for she is your life." So there's a biblical value that says education is critical to success in life. I think most people would agree with that. And so the goal here should be, how can the state of Oklahoma, which unfortunately ranks near the bottom of effectiveness in our public school systems, we're ranked somewhere like 46th or 47th out of 50 states for the way that our public schools across the state, the kind of students that they produce. Given that, and the importance of education, you think that we as a state would be open to anything that significantly improves the product or the child that is graduating out of our school systems, and we hope to keep in Oklahoma as productive citizens who are furthering the economic and other elements that are critical to a successful state. Another verse in Proverbs 22, verse 6, says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and even when he grows older, he will not abandon it." That is a typical idea in the Bible that children should be trained. They don't live by instinct. They have to be civilized. They have to be trained. And we have a school approach, an educational approach, that ideally partners with families to provide the training necessary for a child to grow up, understanding the difference between right and wrong, having some sense of the communal values that make a society strong, able to thrive. And so, again, the Bible is strongly in favor of the idea of professional education partnering with parents to raise up children. Now, here's where the problem becomes in. A third verse in Proverbs is Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7. This verse says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction." I think most people would agree that fools despise wisdom and instruction, but the argument here is that the fear of the Lord is actually the beginning of knowledge. In other words, in order to be truly educated, there needs to be some foundational understanding of what makes things right and wrong. The Bible teaches that right and wrong flows out of the nature of God Himself, and that He is the standard by which all things are measured and evaluated. In public schools, we have developed over the generations this idea, which is absolutely absurd, that a public school is a value-neutral location, that we keep controversial values out and we just teach basic educational content. Well, not only is that not possible, and it's never been true, it has absolutely been shown to be a lie in recent years as the controversy over LGBTQ curricula, transgender curricula, some of the curriculum related to America being stolen land. I mean, all of the stuff that has been swirling in the last 20 years that has been put into our schools, making the schools a source often of propaganda for a particular ideology. That has shown us that schools are never value neutral. They're never objective and limited only to educational content. They've always been about producing a certain kind of way of thinking, a worldview, by raising up a generation to hold certain values. And here's where the Attorney General is wrong. He says that government money should not support a religious school. But see, government money is an interesting euphemism. He's talking about our money, our tax money. And if I choose for my tax money to go towards the education of my children in a particular way that I make a choice for, there's not a contradiction there of the government making me use my money in a way that goes against my conscience, which is what the separation of church and state is about. There can be no institution of religion supported by the state because I might have an objection to my tax dollars being used for a religious institution that disagrees with my belief system. That's not what this is. These are schools where parents will choose to apply for their children. They will choose for their tax monies to be directed in that way. And Attorney General Drummond says, but what if we have an application for a Muslim school someday? What if we do? I'm not afraid of a Christian school going toe-to-toe in the public square with a Muslim school. You say, well, what if that Muslim school begins to turn out terrorists? Well, we have laws about that. That school doesn't have the right to do that if they're teaching things that directly contradict American civil law. If they produce things that go against us, that would be a violation of their charter, and those schools would be discontinued. But the idea that religious schools should be kept out of this because we don't want to support those viewpoints is faulty thinking when you understand that we're supporting other very controversial viewpoints, and we do it all the time as a matter of course. One school district in Oklahoma recently had to pass a rule that you can't display ideological flags and posters in the classroom. Why did they need the rule? Because there were teachers decorating their classrooms with rainbow flags and LGBTQ promotional materials. Well, you don't need the law unless that's become a problem. So the people who say we don't have that problem in the schools clearly are not paying attention. We do have a problem, not in every classroom, not in every school, not in every school district. But the idea that the state of Oklahoma has somehow violated religious discrimination laws by refusing to establish a Catholic virtual charter school, in my mind, that's a real problem. Christian schools have always had to sort of fight uphill because they've never received any kind of government support. In fact, if your kids are in private schools, private Christian schools, it's not like the state typically gives back your money. Only recently has the state of Oklahoma been a pioneer in this area in now making monies available for families to go to private schools. We are a leader in this area, and it has allowed private schools to really become available for families who are scrambling to find other options than the public schools that they have been forced into by circumstances for so many years. If charter schools become yet another option, I see nothing there except good news for Oklahoma families. Watch the news because in the next few weeks, probably sometime in the month of June, the Supreme Court will issue their decision in the state of Oklahoma versus St. Isidore Charter School, and we'll see where the Supreme Court takes us. One interesting side note here, Amy Coney Barrett, who would probably be on the side of the charter school in this question, she has recused herself from the argument because of a prior relationship with a lawyer a prior working relationship with a lawyer that has represented St. Isidore. So she has removed herself from consideration to avoid any conflict of interest, which means there are only 8 Supremes listening to this case. Now, here's the thing. If the conservative side prevails, then the Oklahoma Supreme Court decision to revoke the charter for St. Isidore will be reversed, and St. Isidore will again be able to move forward in establishing in Oklahoma this charter school. But with Amy Coney Barrett out of the equation, depending on what Chief Justice John Roberts does, there is a possibility that this court case could come down to a 4-4 tie. And if that happens, then the lower court's decision would stand. So there's a lot at stake here and an interesting way to look at this. But as we evaluate it from a biblical standpoint, our argument has to be that the Bible has always had tremendous value given to education. It even argues that education is something that you should hold on to tightly because it is the key to a successful life. But the Bible also says that the beginning of knowledge is the fear of the Lord. And so viewpoint discrimination by the state of Oklahoma ultimately will work against the success of our state in educating our children, partnering with our families, and moving us forward economically and socially as a state. Oklahoma has helped private schools by a program that puts money back in the pockets of families so that they can afford private Christian school tuitions. That's a plus. Now, will we find ourselves helping the rest of our children, those who don't have access maybe to private Christian schools, by providing a charter school, an online charter school that will make, even in the most rural areas, a value-driven education an affordable possibility. It's interesting that Gettner Drummond, our Attorney General, is a Republican. In my mind, he is on the wrong side of this issue, and the state of Oklahoma should be embarrassed that they have taken this all the way to the Supreme Court. Let's see what happens here. But religious education, value-driven education based on the Word of God, that is a good thing for the state of Oklahoma. Private schools or online charter schools with Christian values, that is not a compromise of the Constitution. It is not a breach of the separation of church and state. It is a recognition that this is the best way to produce what we really need: adults who are educated and understand the difference between right and wrong. The decision will be out in a couple of weeks. Watch for it, because it's going to be precedent-setting nationwide. This is Truth Currents.